Bavaria, Germany. April 1945, 11 o'clock hours. A captured German colonel sits in a converted schoolhouse, flanked by 2 American intelligence officers and a translator. The routine questioning has covered troop movements, supply lines, defensive positions, standard debriefing protocol for thousands of Wehrmacht prisoners flooding Allied interrogation centers across occupied Germany. Then the lead interrogator leans forward and shifts the conversation. "If you could choose never to face one American general again," he asks, "who would it be?" The colonel doesn't hesitate. "Patton," he says quietly, and his face tightens as he speaks the name. Not Bradley, whose forces were larger. Not Eisenhower, who commanded the entire theater. Not Montgomery, with his methodical precision. Patton. The American captain stops writing. The translator glances up from his notes. Outside, a truck engine rumbles and fades. The colonel's hands rest flat on the wooden table, not clenched, not fidgeting, just still. The stillness of someone who has finally said aloud what he's known for months. But what did this enemy officer understand about George S. Patton that even some Allied commanders didn't fully grasp? By spring 1945, Allied intelligence had shifted focus from winning battles to understanding how they'd been won. Across hundreds of interrogation centers in occupied Germany, officers like Colonel Bruce Clark and Captain Howard Randall compiled psychological profiles of captured Wehrmacht personnel, hoping to extract insights on American command effectiveness that couldn't be gleaned from battlefield reports alone. The rooms were sparse. Wooden chairs, a single bulb overhead, stacks of tactical maps marked with retreat lines in red pencil. The questions were designed to pierce German professional pride. Which generals did you underestimate? Which ones terrified your staff planners? Whose movements could you never predict? The interrogators weren't seeking praise or validation. They wanted tactical truth, the kind of admission that only comes from exhaustion, defeat, and the psychological relief of no longer having to maintain the fiction of invincibility. As captured officers named Bradley, Eisenhower, and Montgomery in their responses, intelligence teams noticed a pattern emerging from the transcripts. One name appeared repeatedly, spoken with a distinct edge of reluctance and dread. The light from the single bulb cast long shadows across interrogation tables throughout Bavaria and the Rhineland. Translators leaned closer, pencils ready, as each new prisoner was brought in and the same question was posed, and the same answer kept surfacing. Wehrmacht doctrine in 1944 operated on a comforting assumption. American generals were cautious, methodical, and above all, predictable. German staff officers had studied Eisenhower's deliberate planning style, Bradley's steady coordination between army groups, and Montgomery's well-documented preference for overwhelming force before initiating movement. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's headquarters issued tactical briefs that portrayed U.S. commanders as risk-averse, men who relied on material superiority rather than operational daring. In briefing rooms across occupied France, German colonels reviewed situation maps with a certain confidence built on professional training and combat experience. Americans would consolidate before advancing, pause to secure supply lines, telegraph their intentions through visible build-up patterns along the front. This predictability, they believed, bought precious time. Time to reposition understrength units, reinforce vulnerable sectors, prepare counterattacks with whatever armored reserves remained. The folders on their desks were thick with Allied radio intercepts and reconnaissance photographs, all analyzed through a lens of expected behavior rooted in traditional military theory. Lamps burned late into the night as staff officers plotted defensive responses based on what American doctrine suggested would happen next. But there was one American general whose files kept growing thinner, whose actions systematically defied the templates and assumptions. As autumn rain began to hammer against the windows of French chateaux turned into German command posts, staff officers started circling a name on their intelligence reports with increasing unease. August 1944. Patton's Third Army exploded out of the Normandy breakout with a speed that shattered every German defensive timeline. While Allied operational plans called for methodical advances to secure Breton ports and consolidate supply lines, Patton ignored the prescribed protocols. His armored columns raced 400 miles in 2 weeks, bypassing strongpoints, isolating entire garrisons, moving faster than German intelligence networks could track, or German reserves could respond. Wehrmacht commanders in Brittany found themselves surrounded before reinforcement orders even reached division headquarters. In a commandeered chateau near Rennes, a German regimental commander stared at a situation map where blue arrows representing Patton's armor had appeared 60 kilometers beyond where every tactical projection said they were supposed to be. The radio crackled with panicked reports. American tanks in Mayenne, American tanks in Laval, American infantry already crossing the Loire River. The doctrine, the carefully constructed playbook that had served the Wehrmacht through Poland, France, and Russia, said Americans would pause, consolidate their gains, wait for supplies to catch up. Patton didn't pause. His columns kept moving through the night, refueling on the move, bypassing resistance rather than reducing it, exploiting the psychological shock of speed itself. By the time von Rundstedt's staff updated their situation maps each morning, the front line was already obsolete, rendered meaningless by movements that had occurred hours earlier in the darkness. A colonel slammed his fist on the mahogany table, not in anger, but in dawning realization. Chairs scraped against stone floors as officers scrambled to issue retreat orders, knowing they were already hours too late. September and October 1944. German intelligence networks began reporting contradictory sightings of Patton's Third Army that violated every principle of force concentration they understood. Radio intercepts placed his headquarters in 3 different locations simultaneously. Reconnaissance photographs showed massive tank formations that vanished within 24 hours. Captured American prisoners gave conflicting reports about divisional movements and attack axes. Wehrmacht analysts couldn't reconcile the data. It made no tactical sense. What they didn't know, Patton was using sophisticated deception units, fake radio traffic mimicking entire divisions, inflatable tanks photographed from the air, coordinated misinformation fed through double agents to mask his true axis of advance while exploiting German reliance on signals intelligence. In a reinforced bunker near Metz, a general major reviewed the latest intercepts with mounting frustration, his cigarette burning unsmoked in a glass ashtray. The reports showed Patton's armor preparing to strike north toward the Saar, then east toward the Rhine, then south toward Alsace, all at once, all supposedly confirmed through multiple intelligence sources. "It's impossible," he muttered to his aide, a young captain who'd studied at the Kriegsakademie before the war. "You cannot mass forces for 3 separate offensives simultaneously, the logistics alone." But the reports kept coming, each one contradicting the last. The young captain marked possible attack vectors on acetate overlays, each layer showing a different threat, each one plausible, none of them reconcilable with the others. The bunker smelled of stale coffee and damp concrete. As the general major stepped outside for air, he watched supply trucks retreat eastward under cold moonlight. Another withdrawal, another tacit admission that they couldn't pin Patton down long enough to stop him. December 1944. Germany launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge, betting everything on a calculated assumption that American lines would fracture under sudden winter assault, that Allied commanders would need days to coordinate an effective response, that strategic surprise still worked against U.S. forces despite their material advantages. For 48 hours, the desperate gamble seemed to validate German planning. Allied units fell back in confusion, command posts evacuated under artillery fire, supply depots burned to prevent capture. Then George S. Patton did what German operational planning assumed was impossible for any conventional army. He pivoted an entire army, 3 full divisions comprising more than 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles. 90 degrees in 48 hours. While Eisenhower's staff at Schaff debated response timelines and Montgomery argued for a defensive perimeter, Patton was already moving. The Third Army reoriented from an eastward offensive into Germany to a northward relief mission toward Bastogne, across icy roads, in the middle of winter, without losing operational cohesion or combat effectiveness. Third Army units attacked into the southern flank of the German Bulge on December 22nd, just 3 days after receiving the order. Not 3 weeks. Not even 3 days of preparation, followed by attack. 3 days total, from order to assault. In a farmhouse command post near Bastogne, a captured Wehrmacht major reviewed this timeline during his first interrogation session. He kept checking the dates in the translated documents, assuming errors in translation or transcription. 3 days? He repeated, looking at the American intelligence officer across the table. You moved 3 divisions, 3 entire divisions, in 3 days? Through that weather? Across those roads? The captain nodded without expression. The major sat back in his chair, his face slack with comprehension. Outside, snow continued falling, muffling the distant thunder of artillery that marked the Third Army's advance. April 1945, Bavaria. The same interrogation room, the same wooden table, the same single bulb overhead. The German colonel, Oberst Heinrich Weber, a composite identity drawn from multiple interrogation transcripts, had commanded Panzer Grenadier units through France, Belgium, and the Ardennes. His uniform was clean, but worn at the collar and cuffs, his face creased with an exhaustion that went far deeper than mere physical fatigue. He'd been a professional soldier for 22 years. He knew what defeat looked like. This was something different. The American translator repeated the question one more time, making sure the phrasing was exact. If you could choose never to face one American general in combat again, which general would that be? Weber looked at the water-stained ceiling for a long moment, then directly at the interrogator. Patton, he said quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the admission cost him something. Because you cannot prepare for him. You cannot build a defense that accounts for what he will do. He does not fight the way you expect a general to fight, the way we were all taught that generals must fight. He fights without regard for his flanks, without waiting for perfect conditions, without following any predictable operational sequence. He attacks when it makes no sense to attack. And by the time you realize where he actually is, what his true objective was, he's already won. Your entire defensive plan is already obsolete. The room went absolutely silent. The American captain's pencil stopped moving across the page. The translator glanced at his shorthand notes, ensuring he'd captured every word correctly. Outside, a truck engine rumbled to life and faded into the distance. Weber's hands remained flat on the table, not clenched in anger, not fidgeting with anxiety, just still. The absolute stillness of someone who had finally articulated aloud what he'd known in his bones for months. The single bulb overhead, cast his shadow long across the scarred wooden floor. The interrogation transcript reached Schaff headquarters in Reims within 36 hours, carried by courier and marked for immediate analysis. Staff officers read Weber's statement alongside similar testimonies that had been accumulating from other captured officers over the preceding weeks. 7 colonels, 2 generals, multiple battalion commanders, all independently naming Patton as the most psychologically disruptive American commander on the Western Front. What stunned intelligence analysts wasn't the praise itself. It was the reasoning embedded in these testimonies. German officers didn't fear Patton because he commanded more tanks than Bradley or had better air support than other sectors. They feared him because he operated outside the decision-making frameworks they'd been trained to counter, the operational templates that had defined professional military thinking for generations. He'd made their education worthless. In a windowless briefing room at Chef, Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's chief of intelligence, laid out the translated transcripts for his staff. "They're not describing superior tactics," he said, tapping the pages with his pipe stem. "They're describing psychological collapse. Patton doesn't just defeat their units. He makes them doubt their own training, their own judgment, their own understanding of how war works." An aide noted that Third Army after-action reports consistently documented lower enemy morale among captured Wehrmacht soldiers than in sectors facing other Allied commanders, even when German units were comparably equipped and led. The implications spread through Allied command like a slow-burning fuse. Officers leaned back in their chairs, absorbing what this meant. The most effective general on the Western Front wasn't the most cautious, the most prepared, or the most conventional. He was the one who made professional enemy officers stop believing in their own doctrine. Patton's effectiveness on the battlefield wasn't accidental or instinctive. It was the product of a deliberate, career-long military philosophy that systematically inverted traditional assumptions about caution and risk. Where most generals saw danger in rapid advance without secured flanks, Patton saw greater danger in hesitation that allowed the enemy time to recover and reorganize. Where doctrine emphasized consolidating gains before pushing forward, he argued that speed itself was security, that moving faster than the enemy could react rendered their counterattack plans obsolete before they could even be executed. His pre-war writings, studied intensively at Fort Benning and Fort Knox throughout the 1930s, emphasized psychological shock over material attrition. The enemy must be forced into perpetual reaction mode. He'd written in a 1933 essay, "A defender who spends every hour responding to your movements has no time to plan his own offensive action. Tempo is a weapon more decisive than artillery." This wasn't recklessness disguised as aggression. It was calculated, theory-driven operational art predicated on understanding that modern mechanized warfare's tempo inherently favored the attacker who refused to pause. German doctrine, by contrast, was built on methodical response cycles. Identify the threat axis, assess enemy strength and intentions, coordinate reserves, execute a measured counterattack. That system worked beautifully against predictable opponents who telegraphed their moves. Against Patton, it created a fatal operational lag. By the time Wehrmacht staff officers completed their analysis and issued movement orders, Patton's forces had already advanced beyond the sector they were analyzing, attacking in a different location entirely. In war colleges across post-war Germany, instructors would later teach Patton's campaigns as definitive case studies in tempo-based warfare. The art of winning not by destroying the enemy army, but by making the enemy's decision cycle irrelevant. By March 1945, German commanders on the Western Front faced a cascading morale crisis that transcended equipment shortages, fuel starvation, or Allied air superiority. They'd lost faith in their own ability to predict and counter American operations whenever Patton's Third Army was involved. Intercepted German communications, declassified in the 1970s, showed staff officers requesting transfers away from sectors facing Third Army forces, citing not cowardice or exhaustion, but operational futility. The professional judgment that defensive preparations were meaningless when the enemy attacked before you finished building them. This crisis of confidence wasn't limited to junior officers or demoralized conscripts. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, issued increasingly fatalistic assessments to Berlin throughout March and early April. His reports noted that Patton's units achieved breakthrough to exploitation transitions in hours rather than the days or weeks that German doctrine assumed were necessary. That speed rendered German armored reserves strategically useless, because they couldn't redeploy fast enough to reach threatened sectors before those sectors had already collapsed. The Wehrmacht's entire defensive philosophy, built on mobile reserves, calculated counterattacks, and elastic defense in depth, simply stopped functioning in sectors facing the Third Army. It wasn't that German units fought poorly or gave up without resistance. It was that the operational system designed to employ them effectively had been invalidated by an opponent who moved too fast for the system to process. In a bunker outside Kassel, a German operations officer burned situation maps that had become obsolete within 12 hours of being drawn. The smoke curled upward through ventilation shafts as American artillery rumbled steadily closer from the west. Outside, engineers wired bridges for demolition, not because destroying them would stop Patton's advance, but because doing nothing at all felt worse than futile action. Patton's operational approach, dismissed by some Allied contemporaries as reckless showboating that wasted fuel and risked encirclement, became foundational to post-war American armor doctrine. The U.S. Army's airland battle concept, developed during the 1980s to counter Soviet mass armor, explicitly incorporated Patton's core principles. Exploit enemy reaction time as a weapon. Maintain operational tempo as a force multiplier. Prioritize psychological disruption over territorial consolidation. Soviet military theorists studied Patton's 1944 campaigns with intense focus, recognizing that his methods anticipated the deep operations theory they themselves were simultaneously developing. But the deeper legacy was psychological rather than tactical. Patton proved empirically that in mechanized warfare, initiative trumps preparation. He demonstrated that a general who keeps enemy forces in permanent reaction mode creates a compound advantage. Each successful rapid maneuver not only gains ground, but also degrades enemy command confidence, making the next maneuver even harder to counter effectively. Modern officer training at Fort Leavenworth still uses Patton's August 1944 pursuit across France as the definitive case study in decision cycle dominance. Oberst Weber, the German colonel from that spring interrogation room, survived the war and eventually published a memoir in 1963. In it, he described facing Patton's forces as combat against an opponent who had already decided the battle would be won by refusing to fight it the way we understood war should be fought. That single sentence captured what made Patton uniquely devastating. He didn't just beat German units in tactical engagements. He invalidated the entire mental framework German officers used to understand combat itself. In military museums across Germany today, exhibits on the Western Front campaign dedicate entire sections to explaining why traditional defensive doctrine failed so catastrophically against American forces in 1944 and 1945. Patton's photograph appears in every single one. The interrogation room in Bavaria is gone now, long since converted back into a schoolhouse after the occupation, then demolished decades later, replaced by a parking lot in a reunified Germany that few visitors would recognize as a place where history was quietly documented. But the question asked there in the spring of 1945 echoes through military history as perhaps the ultimate measure of combat effectiveness. Not who commanded the most divisions, who had the best logistics network, or who made the fewest tactical mistakes, but which general made professional enemy soldiers afraid to face him again. Weber's answer wasn't about respect or admiration in any traditional sense. It was an admission that Patton had fundamentally broken something essential in the German command psyche. The confidence that proper doctrine, careful preparation, and experienced leadership could counter any military threat. He'd proven that speed, audacity, and relentless operational pressure could render all three obsolete. Traditional military virtues meant nothing if your enemy moved faster than your decision cycle could process. As historians trace the evolution of modern armored warfare from World War II through the Gulf War and beyond, they return repeatedly to that moment in a Bavarian schoolhouse, when exhausted German officers sat across from Allied interrogators and admitted, one by one, the same uncomfortable truth. The general they feared most wasn't the one with the biggest army, the most resources, or the most conventional brilliance. It was the one who refused to let them think, who moved so fast and so unpredictably that thinking itself became a liability rather than an advantage. The last light fades on the old situation maps. The archives close for another night. But the question remains relevant far beyond 1945. In war, the most devastating weapon isn't always the one that destroys the most. Sometimes it's the one that makes the enemy stop believing they can win.